Hello. So this week we're starting to look at the book of Jonah in the Bible. So today I'm going to talk about the first chapter that you should have all read this week. And in case you haven't, I'll read it just now. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down, and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said to him, What is this you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, What shall we do to you, that the sea may quieten down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Okay. So, the first thing that you have to think about when you read a passage in the Bible is the context. Like, what was the world like when it was written? Who wrote it? And what style is it? Like in the Bible, there's prophecy, poetry, and all different types of writing. So we need to find out what kind this is, because that affects the way we read it. So some people think that Jonah is an allegory. So, like, it didn't really happen. It's just a metaphor, like a nice story with a special meaning. And people think this because some of the stuff that happens in it is a bit wild, like a guy survives getting swallowed by a fish. But in the New Testament, Jesus actually mentions the story of Jonah, and he talks about it like it's a real thing that happened. And also another book in the Old Testament called 2 Kings, which is about the history of Israel, mentions Jonah. So I think it's most likely that it is an actual historical story, but it still has a meaning for us to find out. So, Jonah is in the Old Testament, so that means it happened a really long time ago and before Jesus was on earth. And at the time when this was written, the king of Israel was a guy called Jeroboam II, and during his reign, things were pretty good for Israel. They did have enemies. Their kind of main one was a country called Assyria, and Nineveh, the city that God told Jonah to go to in the story, was like a really big city in Assyria. So, Nineveh were the enemy. And they were Gentiles, which means that they weren't Jews, so they didn't follow God. They would have worshipped their own, like, fake gods, so that's bad. And the people of Israel are Jews, so they did follow God, so that's good. So that kind of gives you a description of how things were at the time and place this was written. So the only question I haven't answered is who wrote Jonah. It doesn't actually say anywhere, so we don't know for sure, but most people think that it was written by Jonah himself, because a lot of the story he's the only one there, so he's the only person who would like know the details. So that kind of gives you like the context of the chapter we just read, and you might be thinking like, how are you supposed to know all that? Like, if you were reading this yourself, how would you know all the background to the story? Well, I'm not like super smart. I didn't just come up with it myself. There's a few things I used. First, I have a study Bible that I think you might have heard me talk about before. So it's just like a regular Bible, but it's got like explanations and things written underneath, like on every page. And it's also got a big introduction bit at the start of each book where it explains all of this stuff. Plus there's loads more things like bits of history and things that helps understand the context of all the stories of the Bible. It's really helpful and I really recommend getting one. But even just like normal Bibles can sometimes have little introductions to each book that helps you find out some of this stuff. So always check that out. Look at what's in your Bible. There's always a lot of things that aren't just the Bible. And of course there's so much helpful stuff on the internet. Like the video that I sent earlier in the week from the Bible Project, which I hope you all watched. They have loads of good stuff, and there's tons more if you look for it. So try that when you're reading the Bible. Plus, of course, if you're confused, you all have people that you can ask for help, and that's important too. So back to Jonah. Now we've kind of got the context. Let's take a look at what actually happens in the story. I like to start with a story like this by going through who the characters are. So first, of course, we have Jonah. He was a prophet, and that just means he was given a message by God to tell other people. So at the start of the chapter, Jonah is given his message and told to tell it to the people of Nineveh. And remember, that's not part of his country, Israel. It's part of Assyria, who are the enemies. We don't find out why until later, but Jonah ignores God and gets on a boat to go to Tarshish. Now, my study Bible has a little map, so I can see that Jonah was basically going as far in the opposite direction of Nineveh as he possibly could. So, like, he was serious about running away from God and what he was supposed to do. Then, when he's on the boat, he just falls asleep and ignores the big storm that's almost making the ship sink. Like, what's Jonah playing at? Then, when the sailors managed to wake him up and ask him who he was, he answered, I am a Hebrew. And that's just another word for a Jew, so one of God's people who follow the true God. So that's good. He says, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. So that answer that he gives is a bit confusing, because he says he fears the Lord, but if that's true, why isn't he obeying him? And he says that God made the sea and the dry land, so why does he think he's able to run away from him? Like, if God made everything, I'm pretty sure he can see you hiding in a boat. Seriously, what is Jonah playing at? Then Jonah tells the sailors that to get the storm to stop, they should throw him into the sea. That's kind of weird, because like, he knows what needs to happen to please God and like stop his anger. He needs to turn back and go to Nineveh. But for some reason, he would rather literally drown than give God's message to the people there. And not only that, but like, he could have just jumped off the boat himself, but instead he asks the men on the boat to murder him. Like, that's mad. Imagine someone asks you to throw them off a ship into the sea. The chapter ends with Jonah getting swallowed by a big fish, and he's in the stomach for 3 days and 3 nights, which is awful. So, we've gone through what Jonah did in the passage. The other main characters were the men on the boat. I think in the one I read, they called them mariners. So the first thing this chapter tells us about them is that they were afraid. The storm was so great, they thought their ship was going to break. So it makes sense to be afraid. It also says that they each cried out to their gods. So they clearly were Gentiles. They believed in fake gods, not the real one, so that's bad. It's also interesting that they decided to cast lots to see who had sinned to cause the storm. So like, clearly they were wise enough to see that this storm was something caused by God for some reason. Meanwhile, Jonah the prophet, who's supposed to know these things, is just napping. Next, when Jonah told the men to throw him into the sea, they didn't want to. They knew murder was bad, and they tried all they could to keep the boat going so that they wouldn't need to kill him. Eventually, they did throw him overboard, but they prayed first, and not to any of their fake gods, but to the actual real God. They said, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." In this prayer, they recognise that God has the right to judge their actions and that he has done as he pleased. Everything that is happening is in his will, and they cry out to him for mercy. Finally, the last thing that the passage tells us about the men is that they were afraid again. In the beginning, they feared the storm, but at the end, they feared God. The men had clearly gone through some transformation. God had used all this crazy stuff to bring a bunch of sailors to him, Gentiles who weren't even a part of his people. So, now we've kind of gone through what happened in the story, we should try and figure out what the message is. And maybe you can have a think about that before we meet on Zoom tomorrow. The first question you should ask is, what does this teach us about God? And how does it point to Jesus? And it might seem a bit random, like this little story about a mad prophet and a bunch of sailors has nothing to do with Jesus, but actually every part of the Bible is a part of the story of Jesus. So think about what in this passage could relate to what Jesus did. Or are there any characters or anything like that seem to represent Jesus? Finally, we should try and apply what we learn from the passage to our lives. Here's some questions for you to think about. Does the passage challenge anything that you believe? Or does it confirm what you believe? How does it shape the way you view God? How does it shape the way you view yourself? What about the way you view the world or your current circumstances? Are there any attitudes or behaviour in your life that you need to change? And finally, how can you respond to this story in prayer? So have a think about all that stuff, and we'll talk about it on Zoom tomorrow night, so you better be there. Bye!